During a routine hike in the mountains, a man accidentally stumbled upon something that had been hidden for decades. Among the rocks, he saw the wreckage of a huge private plane. But the worst part began when he decided to look inside. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The early morning air was thin and sharp, each breath of it cutting into his lungs as if the mountain itself were testing his resolve. The man adjusted the straps of his heavy backpack and looked up at the jagged line of peaks rising above him. He had studied maps for months, traced routes with his finger late at night under the glow of a desk lamp, and marked the points where other climbers had turned back. Now it was his turn to face the mountain, and he intended to do so alone. There was no audience, no one waiting at the base camp to applaud his courage, and no partner to share the silence. That was the way he wanted it. His name was Jordan, though the mountain did not care who he was. 39 years of life had left him strong in body but heavier in spirit. Years spent in a restless city had carved lines of tension across his face. He had once worked behind a desk, buried in endless files and deadlines, until the day he realized he was suffocating not from lack of air but from lack of meaning. Some people found solace in family, others in religion, but Jordan sought clarity in isolation, in the challenge of Earth's rawest places. The higher and lonelier the peak, the closer he felt to something that resembled truth. Preparation had been his obsession for weeks. He remembered standing in his cramped apartment, meticulously checking every piece of gear laid out on the floor like a soldier inspecting weapons before battle. Rope coiled into precise loops, the gleam of steel carabiners catching the light, a sturdy tent tested for leaks under the spray of his shower, boots softened from long walks through city streets, and layers of clothing designed to withstand storms that could freeze the marrow of his bones. Into the side pocket of his pack he slipped a small black notebook, not larger than a hand, filled with scattered notes and half-finished thoughts. He always carried it, writing when the silence of the wilderness pressed too deeply into his mind. As he climbed through the first stage of the ascent, the landscape shifted with each mile. At the lower elevations, the forest still whispered with life. Birds darted among branches heavy with frost, and the ground was soft with needles and damp earth. The air carried the faint smell of pine and resin, comforting in its familiarity. Jordan moved with measured steps, adjusting to the rhythm of the incline, his muscles warming with the steady climb. Each stride was deliberate, for he knew the higher he went, the more unforgiving the terrain would become. By midday, the forest thinned and surrendered to the realm of stone. The trail became a narrow vein etched into the mountainside, loose gravel crunching under his boots. He paused once, leaning against a rock wall and gazing out across the valley below. From here, the world looked endless, a quilt of ridges fading into the horizon, each one darker than the last. He felt a sense of detachment, as though he were leaving behind not only the land, but the weight of everything that had chained him to his past. The arguments that had driven him from his last job, the disappointment etched in his father's face when Jordan had abandoned a safe career, the failed relationship that had ended in silence, all of it seemed to shrink into nothingness as he rose higher. As the sun dipped lower, the mountain revealed its harsher face. The wind funneled through the ravines with a piercing whistle, tugging at his jacket and chilling the sweat on his back. The rocks grew sharper, the ledges narrower, and each step demanded full attention. His body began to ache with the burden of his pack and the strain of balancing against the pull of gravity. Yet, in this discomfort, Jordan felt alive. Each bead of sweat and each twinge in his muscles was proof that he was here, away from the dull routine of office corridors and screens. That evening, he found a flat ledge where he could pitch his tent. He unrolled the nylon fabric and drove the stakes into the hard ground with practiced efficiency. When the small shelter stood against the wind, he crawled inside and lit a compact stove. The hiss of burning gas filled the tent, and soon the air warmed with steam from a pot of noodles. He ate slowly, savoring the heat in his chest, and then unzipped the side pocket of his pack to retrieve the notebook. By the glow of his headlamp, he scribbled thoughts that came unbidden, fragments about fear, freedom, and the strange pull of loneliness. Outside, the night deepened into absolute blackness. The sky above was alive with stars, so numerous and sharp that it seemed the universe had poured its secrets onto the mountain. Jordan left the tent for a moment, standing in the biting cold with his head tilted back. The Milky Way cut across the heavens like a river of fire, ancient and untouchable. He felt small, insignificant, and yet part of something vast and unbroken. The wind roared through the peaks, carrying with it the echoes of a world that had existed long before him and would endure long after. Sleep came slowly. The thin fabric of the tent did little to soften the howling wind. The cold crept relentlessly through his sleeping bag. Every rustle of fabric and whistle of air pulled him from drowsiness back into alertness. He lay awake, listening to the mountain's voice, and wondered if he would ever feel at peace in silence. It was not peace he sought, he realized, but confrontation, a test against the indifferent elements, a measure of his will. When finally his eyes closed, the mountain kept watch, unyielding and immense. The next morning dawned pale and unforgiving. Jordan broke camp early, moving with stiff limbs and a determination that bordered on stubbornness. The trail was gone now, replaced by bare rock and icy patches that forced him to use his hands as much as his feet. The air thinned, and each breath became a deliberate act, his lungs dragging in what little oxygen remained. His heart pounded with the effort, echoing in his ears like a drum, yet still he climbed, drawn by a compulsion he could not entirely name. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather, curling around the peaks like smoke from an unseen fire. The light dimmed, and shadows stretched across the cliffs. Jordan pressed onward, though the sense of isolation grew heavier with each step. He was far above the line of trees, cut off from any sign of human presence. There was only the sound of his boots against stone and the ceaseless breath of the wind. He paused once more, resting on a jagged ledge, and drank from his canteen. The water was ice-cold, numbing his teeth as he swallowed, and for a brief moment he wondered if he was chasing something that could never be caught. Yet, as he sat there, gazing out across the vast emptiness, he felt it again, the whisper of meaning hidden in the silence. The mountain was no teacher, no guide, and no friend. It was simply there, immense and unyielding, and in facing it, Jordan was forced to face himself. His legs trembled when he rose, but his spirit pressed forward, step after step, into the unknown heights. The sun dipped toward the horizon, setting the ridges aflame with golden light. Shadows deepened in the valleys, while the peaks blazed like molten stone. Jordan trudged onward, unaware that fate had already placed something extraordinary in his path. Somewhere higher, hidden among the folds of rock, a secret waited for him, one that would shatter the solitude he had sought and replace it with a mystery that would consume every thought. When, at last, he pitched his tent for the second night, exhaustion settled into his bones. He lay in silence, his body aching but his mind restless. The notebook remained unopened beside him, as if even his thoughts had grown too heavy to put into words. Outside, the wind sang its ceaseless song, weaving between the cliffs like an ancient spirit. And, far above, unseen in the fading light, metal glinted faintly in a crevice between two peaks, waiting for his eyes to find it. The path of a lone traveler was about to turn into something far more than a test of endurance. It was about to become a confrontation with history, with secrets buried in the cold embrace of the mountain, and with the question of why he, out of all people, had been chosen to find them. The morning broke with a thin veil of mist curling between the jagged ridges, softening the sharp lines of the mountains, yet adding an eerie stillness to the air. Jordan awoke with stiff limbs, his breath forming small clouds inside the thin tent, and for a moment he lay listening to the faint moan of the wind sliding through unseen corridors of stone. The second night on the mountain had left his muscles sore and his mind restless, as though the silence itself pressed against him, asking questions he could not answer. He stretched slowly, packed his gear with deliberate movements, and stepped out onto the ledge where the world fell away in a sweeping panorama. The valley below was drowned in shadow, while the peaks above caught the first glimmer of sunlight, their crowns glowing faintly like embers in the sky. The climb resumed with a rhythm that had become both familiar and taxing. Each step was measured, each placement of his boot tested before shifting weight. For a single misjudgment here would send him tumbling into a chasm where no one would ever find him. He accepted the danger with the calm determination of someone who had already decided the risk was worth it. Higher he went, into thinner air, where each breath felt like a stolen gift. His lungs burned, and the taste of iron filled his mouth. The mountain gave nothing easily, and that was why he had come. Around midday he paused to drink and wipe sweat from his brow, despite the cold that seeped into his bones. It was then, as he leaned against the rough face of a boulder, that something caught his eye. At first, it was only a glint, a brief flash as the sun shifted behind a cloud and then returned. He squinted, thinking it might be the surface of ice or perhaps a wet rock polished by melting snow. Yet the glimmer came again, sharp and metallic from a narrow cleft higher up the slope. He blinked, frowning, his instincts both curious and cautious. Trash left by other climbers maybe, though few ever dared this high, or a lost piece of equipment abandoned years ago. The rational explanations calmed him for only a moment, but some part of him stirred with a different awareness. There was something unnatural about the gleam, something that did not belong to this barren wilderness. Compelled, Jordan resumed his ascent, altering his course towards the source of the reflection. The climb grew more treacherous, the rocks loose and unreliable, and twice he nearly slipped when gravel cascaded beneath his boots. He steadied himself with his hands, his fingers scraped raw by the cold stone, his breath coming hard as he pulled himself higher. The glint grew larger, no longer a fleeting flash but a steady presence hidden behind an outcrop. His pulse quickened, the anticipation rising inside him despite the fatigue dragging at his limbs. He told himself it was nothing, yet his heart knew otherwise. When he finally hauled himself over the ridge and saw it clearly, he froze. His mind rejected the image at first, as though his eyes were lying, but there it was, undeniable and immense. Wedged between two cliffs, its nose buried deep into rock and its wings snapped like broken bones, lay the skeletal remains of a private jet. Time had stripped it of its luster, the once polished fuselage now corroded, its paint blistered and peeling, windows cracked and opaque with frost. The tail fin jutted upward like a gravestone, and its logo faded beyond recognition. Jordan stood in stunned silence, the wind whipping around him but his body motionless, as if rooted to the spot. 1,000 questions collided in his mind at once, none with answers. How could a jet have reached this place? There was no runway within hundreds of miles, no open field wide enough for landing. The altitude alone made such a sight impossible. And yet it was there, undeniable, its vast shape pressed into the mountainside like a relic of another world. The first surge of fear ran through him then. This was no ordinary discovery, and the very strangeness of it gnawed at the edges of his courage. His instincts told him to turn back, to leave it undisturbed, for there was something unnatural about finding a machine of luxury and human ambition entombed in such a merciless place. Yet another force worked against that fear, a pull of curiosity, deep and relentless. He had not come to the mountain only to climb its stones. He had come to confront what lay hidden, even if he had not known it until this moment. Step by cautious step, he moved closer. The size of the wreck astonished him. What, from below, had seemed like a scrap of metal revealed itself to be an entire aircraft, its cabin split open where the fuselage had torn on impact. Twisted fragments of wing lay scattered like bones around the crash site, half buried in scree. He reached out with trembling fingers and touched the cold metal, his glove rasping against rust. It felt solid, real, and that alone sent a shiver through him. This was not a vision or hallucination from lack of oxygen. It was a truth, hard as steel, lying in plain sight. He circled slowly, his boots crunching over gravel, his eyes scanning every detail. The windows along the side had shattered, some hanging in jagged shards. Inside, he glimpsed torn leather seats, their stuffing protruding like old scars. A curtain, once velvet perhaps, dangled in tatters from a broken rail. The smell was faint but distinct. Rust, dust, and something ancient, like fabric long closed in dampness. The more he saw, the more the unease grew. There were no signs of bodies, no obvious remains, only the husk of wealth abandoned to the elements. Jordan stopped a few feet away and simply stared, his breath ragged, his mind caught between awe and dread. The impossible lay before him, and the mountain seemed to hold its breath, the wind dying for a fleeting second as if the world itself acknowledged the weight of the moment. He knew he should rest, gather his strength before deciding what to do, but his thoughts were relentless. If the jet had fallen here, someone had flown it. Someone had lived this last descent. Where were they now? Why had no search party, no rescue team, no government claim ever brought its story to light? Fear prickled at his neck, yet it was quickly smothered by the rising tide of determination. He could not walk away from this. The jet was not just an accident, not just debris. It was a message, silent and stubborn, waiting for someone to read. And Jordan, a lone traveler on the mountain, had become its chosen witness. The daylight waned as he lingered, yet he felt no desire to retreat. His hands shook as he unstrapped his pack and set it down, his eyes locked on the torn fuselage. The shadows within beckoned like the mouth of a cave, dark and heavy with untold stories. The wind rose again, whispering through the fractured frame, and for an instant it sounded almost like voices, echoes of conversations long past. Jordan swallowed hard, his throat dry, and knew that tomorrow he would have to go inside. For now, he stood before the wreck, heart pounding, knowing that his journey had just shifted from one of personal endurance to one of unraveling a mystery buried in steel and silence. The wreck loomed above him throughout the night like a shadow that refused to dissolve into darkness. Jordan had pitched his tent on a narrow ledge a short distance from the torn fuselage, Yet sleep never fully claimed him. Each time he drifted into uneasy rest, the image of the jet returned, its jagged windows staring out like hollow eyes, its wings snapped and scattered like fragments of a skeleton, the silent suggestion that once, long ago, this place had been filled with voices and lives. The wind clawed at the fabric of his tent and moaned through the broken frame of the aircraft, a low, mournful sound that deepened his unease. He lay awake, staring into the shadows until the first light of dawn began to wash the peaks in cold silver. With trembling hands, he prepared a quick meal, though his stomach turned with nerves and he could barely swallow the lukewarm oatmeal. His thoughts circled endlessly, part of him desperate to know what secrets lay within the wreck, another urging him to shoulder his pack and climb away, leaving the mystery undisturbed. Yet the sight of it was too powerful, too impossible to abandon. He knew he would never forgive himself if he walked away now. He had come to the mountains seeking clarity, and here it was, in the form of a question larger than any he had ever faced. The approach to the jet was steep and treacherous. He climbed cautiously, testing each foothold until he reached the gaping wound where the fuselage had split on impact. The opening was wide enough for him to crawl through, though the edges were jagged with twisted metal. He crouched low, heart hammering, and pushed himself inside. At once the air grew colder, thicker, filled with the musty scent of rust, mold, and aged fabric. His boots echoed softly on the tilted floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Shafts of pale light filtered through shattered windows and holes in the body of the aircraft, illuminating dust that swirled like restless spirits disturbed by his intrusion. The first thing that struck him was the emptiness. He had expected carnage, the remains of lives cut short, but what he saw instead was absence. Rows of leather seats stood in disarray, their cushions torn and leaking yellowed foam, but there were no bodies, no bones, not even scraps of clothing that might suggest where the passengers had gone. He moved cautiously down the aisle, brushing past fragments of curtains and broken armrests. A handbag lay open on the floor, its contents spilled long ago. A comb missing several teeth, a cracked compact mirror, a lipstick tube faded and brittle. The sight of such ordinary objects here, preserved in the silence of the mountain, unsettled him more than any grotesque remains might have. They were relics of lives once vibrant, now suspended in mystery. Further in, he found a row of seats where the leather was still intact, though mottled with mildew. A tray table hung loosely from its hinge, and on it lay a champagne flute, cracked but still whole, as if someone had set it down moments before disaster struck. He reached out and touched the glass. It was icy beneath his fingers, and he felt an involuntary shiver crawl up his spine. The wealth and luxury of the jet were unmistakable even in decay. This had not been a common flight. This machine had carried the rich, perhaps the powerful, perhaps those who believed themselves untouchable. Near the middle of the cabin, he found luggage piled against a wall, thrown there by the force of the crash. Several cases had burst open, their contents spilling across the floor. Silk dresses, tailored suits, polished shoes now dulled by dust. A jewelry case lay overturned, its velvet interior still clinging to the faint outline of bracelets and necklaces that were no longer there. Some pieces remained, glinting dully in the dim light. A golden cufflink, a broken pearl necklace, a jeweled hairpin bent out of shape. Jordan crouched to examine them, the glimmer of wealth lying forgotten in this grave of stone and steel. He could not shake the thought that others might have come before him, looters or perhaps survivors who had stripped away what they could carry. At the far end of the cabin, near where the fuselage curved upward toward the cockpit, a door hung askew. He pushed it gently, and it creaked open, revealing a smaller lounge area. Here, the decay seemed even more poignant. Plush armchairs sagged with age, their upholstery split and spilling. A cabinet that once held the crystal glasses lay shattered, fragments glittering faintly on the floor. On a table sat a silver lighter, its once polished surface now tarnished. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and placed it back, unwilling to take anything from this place that felt more like a tomb than a wreck. The silence pressed down heavier the deeper he went, each step a violation of a sanctity he did not fully understand. The aircraft felt less like a machine and more like a mausoleum, a place where time had stopped and memory lingered in the stale air. His flashlight beam danced across the walls, illuminating scratched panels and scrawls that might have been desperate marks left by those who had lived a little while longer after the crash. A faint soot stain marked the floor, as though a small fire had once burned there, perhaps in an attempt to keep warm. The realization that people had survived, even briefly, tightened his chest with a mixture of sorrow and dread. Finally, he reached the cockpit. The door had been ripped nearly from its hinges, and inside he found a twisted ruin of machinery. Panels were shattered, gauges frozen at impossible readings, and wires dangled like entrails. One of the seats was torn from its base and lay sideways, its straps frayed and brittle. Papers littered the floor, maps, flight logs, and fragments of weather reports. He bent to pick one up, but the ink had blurred into illegibility, the paper brittle and fragile as old parchment. He carefully set it back, feeling as though he were disturbing the last whispers of the dead. He stood there for a long time, absorbing the weight of what he had seen. The aircraft was not just a wreck, it was a story, one whose chapters had been violently interrupted and then left to rot in silence. Every torn seat, every scattered belonging spoke of sudden terror, of lives cut from the sky and left to vanish in the mountains. Yet the absence of bodies, the ransacked luggage, the faint traces of survival unsettled him far more than any gruesome sight could have. It was as if the plane had swallowed its secrets whole, and he, intruder from another time, was left with only fragments of the truth. When at last he turned back, the cabin seemed darker than before. He retraced his steps slowly, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting to see someone, or something, following him down the aisle. The air felt heavier, his breathing loud in the stillness. He crawled out through the torn fuselage and emerged into the sharp mountain wind with a gasp of relief, as though he had escaped a prison. He stood outside for a long time, staring at the wreck that now seemed both familiar and alien, knowing that what he had found inside was only the beginning. The mountain had revealed a secret, but it was not finished with him yet. He sensed it in the way the shadows clung to the broken wings, in the way the wind howled through the cracks of the fuselage. Something more waited to be uncovered, something darker than torn seats and scattered jewels. He shouldered his pack, his hands still trembling, and resolved that tomorrow he would search deeper, for he could not leave this mystery unanswered. The flying mausoleum had opened its doors to him, and now he was bound to its silence, whether he wished it or not. The wind had eased by morning, though it carried with it a thin chill that seeped into the seams of Jordan's jacket as he stood once again before the wreck. The previous day's foray into the broken fuselage had left him restless, his mind haunted by images of velvet curtains rotting into threads, of jewels lying in dust, of trays and glasses frozen as if awaiting hands that would never return. He had emerged shaken but determined, his thoughts circling endlessly through the night until he accepted what he already knew. He had to go back inside. The aircraft was no longer simply a ruin to him. It was a question that demanded an answer. His steps echoed against the fractured metal as he re-entered the gaping wound of the fuselage. The air inside felt heavier than before, weighted with the ghosts of silence, though his flashlight cut through the gloom with a narrow blade of light. He moved more deliberately this time, his fear tempered by a strange familiarity. What yesterday had seemed an intrusion now felt like a summons. The jet was speaking to him in fragments, and if he wanted to understand, he would have to follow the trail it laid before him. He made his way toward the cockpit first, navigating past torn rows of seats and overturned luggage. The door, half ripped from its hinges, groaned under his touch as he pushed it wider. He crouched inside the cramped space, scanning the ruined panels. Most of the instruments had shattered, their glass faces spiderwebbed into opacity, but a few dials still bore markings frozen in time. His gloved fingers brushed over the throttle, the plastic brittle and cracked, before he crouched lower to sift through the papers scattered on the floor. Among the debris, he found several scraps that resisted decay. One was a fragment of a weather report, the typed letters faint but still legible enough to make out coordinates and warnings of turbulence. Another was the cover of a flight log, its edges blackened but intact. He turned it over carefully, his pulse quickening. Inside, though many pages were ruined, a few lines remained. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, entries made by the pilot or co-pilot. One of the last legible notes mentioned a deviation from course, forced by sudden conditions, and a cryptic remark about cargo security. Jordan frowned, the words scratching at his mind. Cargo security. It was a phrase that carried weight, suggesting something more than luggage and silk dresses. Leaving the cockpit, he retraced his steps to the lounge area he had examined the day before. Here he paused longer, crouching to examine the soot-stained patch on the floor. He ran his fingers lightly across it, the fine black residue clinging to his gloves. It confirmed his suspicion. Someone had tried to make fire here. Survivors. They had lived inside this steel coffin after it fell. His gaze traveled around the room, searching for further evidence. On the wall near the window, faint scratches marred the metal, too deliberate to be accidents of the crash. He angled his flashlight and traced the marks, initials perhaps, or desperate tallies counting the days. The sight tightened his chest. These were not the careless scrawls of looters, but the whispers of people clinging to life against impossible odds. Driven by a mixture of reverence and dread, Jordan began to open the remaining suitcases strewn about. Many were filled with clothing that had long since stiffened with mold, but others revealed more intimate fragments of lives. A leather-bound diary, its pages warped yet salvageable, contained entries written in elegant script. He turned the fragile paper with care, reading snatches about social events, names of companions, hints of negotiations. One passage described anticipation of a conclusion in Zurich, though what kind of conclusion remained unclear. The writer had been wealthy, comfortable, far removed from the struggles of men like Jordan, and yet, somewhere between the last word and the crash, all that wealth had become worthless in the face of cold and hunger. On a nearby seat, he discovered a wallet, its leather cracked but still whole. Inside were faded photographs, a woman smiling on a sunlit terrace, a child playing with a wooden toy, a man in a tailored suit lifting a glass and a toast. These faces looked out at him across the decades, strangers who had once been alive, full of expectation, now reduced to echoes left behind in a place where no one would ever come looking. Jordan closed the wallet gently, a heaviness in his chest. Deeper in the cabin he found a locked case, dented but intact. The hinges had bent under impact, leaving a gap wide enough for him to pry open with the edge of his multi-tool. The lid creaked, and inside he discovered documents bound with ribbons. Most were contracts, written in languages he only partially understood, but the numbers caught his eye. Vast sums of money, dates aligning with decades past, signatures of names unfamiliar yet grand in flourish. Beneath them lay a sealed envelope, its wax insignia still faintly visible, though cracked with age. He dared not open it now, not without risking its destruction, but its weight in his hands told him it carried secrets intended for no stranger's eyes. The implications swirled in his thoughts as he set the case back. This was no ordinary flight. These were not casual travelers. The opulence of the jet, the secrecy implied in the papers, the sheer improbability of its disappearance without a trace, all of it suggested a story larger than accident or misfortune. And yet, what chilled him more than the mystery of wealth and conspiracy was the human truth beneath it. Men and women who had lived, who had lit fires and scratched marks into walls, who had watched each other fade into the silence of the mountain. He wandered further back into the fuselage, where the light grew dim and the cold more biting. Here the damage was worse, the metal torn into grotesque shapes, the seats crushed together. He stepped carefully, mindful of jagged edges. Among the wreckage lay a scattering of personal effects. A broken watch stopped forever at 3:30, a fountain pen bent and leaking dried ink across the carpet, a woman's shoe with its heel snapped clean away. Each item felt like a whisper of the moment when life had been violently interrupted. Jordan sat down heavily on a twisted seat frame, his breath visible in the stale air. He tried to piece together the fragments, to imagine the last hours or days of those who had been here. The soot stain, the diary, the scratched marks, the opened luggage, all of it spoke of endurance followed by disappearance. Where had they gone? Why had no one ever come searching, or if they had, why had nothing been recorded? He thought of the glint that had drawn him here, how easily he might have missed it, and realized that the mountain itself had kept this secret buried, locked away until chance placed it in his path. The silence pressed against him, heavy and oppressive. He rose slowly, casting one last glance down the shadowed aisle before stepping back into the daylight. The sun had shifted behind clouds, the air crisp and thin, the peaks rising like silent sentinels above him. The jet sat unmoving, a monument to wealth and mortality alike. But now Jordan knew it was also a vault of stories. The traces of the past clung to its walls, fragile yet undeniable, and he carried them in his memory like burdens not his own. As he made his way back toward the ledge where his tent waited, he felt the weight of what he had discovered pressing deeper with every step. The mountain had not yet finished unveiling its secrets. What he had seen was only the beginning, a hint of a larger puzzle whose pieces remained hidden in shadow. Tomorrow, he knew, he would have to push further, to question not only what happened inside the jet, but what had happened afterward. For somewhere in the cold expanse of rock and ice, the fate of the missing lingered, waiting to be unearthed. The day after he uncovered the traces of survival, Jordan woke with a sense of dread pressing on his chest as heavily as the weight of his pack. The sky above the peaks was pale and indifferent. a colorless sweep of air that revealed no warmth and promised no mercy. He brewed a small cup of instant coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the memories of what he had seen scratched into the metal walls of the jet. Every tally mark, every soot-stained remnant of a fire, whispered that life had lingered inside that broken shell, and if life had lingered, then so too had fear, hunger, and desperation. Yet, what struck him more than the evidence of struggle was what remained missing. Not a single body, not a single skeleton, not even a fragment of bone lay among the wreckage. The absence gnawed at him in a way the presence of death never could have. He made his way back into the fuselage, his flashlight beam cutting once more through the stale gloom. The air inside carried the same heavy odor of rust and decay, but beneath it now he imagined the phantom scent of human presence. Smoke from a small fire, sweat from unwashed bodies, the faint tang of fear lingering in the air like an aftertaste. He paused at the blackened stain he had studied the day before, staring at it until it seemed to swell before his eyes, growing into the image of shivering survivors huddled around fragile flames. He could almost hear their whispers in the whistling draft that pushed through the cracks in the fuselage. He pressed on deeper, moving past the lounge and the first rows of seats into sections he had not fully examined. The damage here was more violent. Seats had been torn from their bolts, flung into heaps against the walls. He crouched and sifted through the debris, his gloves brushing aside fragments of carpet and shattered plastic. More personal belongings lay scattered: a pair of spectacles with one lens missing, a pocket diary with several pages ripped out, a child's toy car crushed under the weight of falling metal. Each object spoke of someone who had lived, who had breathed this thin air, whose heart had pounded with the terror of falling from the sky. But again, there were no bodies. The silence became unbearable the longer he stayed. It was not simply the absence of noise, but the suffocating weight of what should have been there. Planes did not crash without leaving traces of the people who rode them. He knelt near the remains of a galley, where metal cabinets had burst open and cans rolled across the tilted floor. Some had been pried open, their jagged edges sharp with rust. He picked one up and shook it gently. It was empty, hollow, but the marks of a knife or stone were clear across its lid. Survivors had eaten here. They had torn open what supplies they could salvage, rationing them against hunger. His throat tightened as he set the can down, wondering what desperation had driven them when those tins ran out. He moved slowly into the rear of the fuselage, where shadows clung more stubbornly and the air seemed colder. Here he found a line of storage compartments, their doors bent or torn away. One compartment was empty, save for a few straps dangling like withered vines, but another held a broken suitcase, its contents spilling across the floor. Papers fluttered faintly in the draft, letters written in rushed handwriting, words blurred by moisture. He crouched to gather them, straining to read. One letter spoke of fear, written perhaps in the hours after the crash. "We are alive, but we cannot last here. The cold grows worse. Food is gone." The last line trailed off into smudges where ink had bled into dampness. Jordan swallowed hard, clutching the paper as if it were the fragile voice of a ghost. When he stood again, the silence pressed in harder than ever. He realized he had been holding his breath, listening for some echo of life, some clue as to where the survivors had gone. But there was nothing. Only the whistle of the wind threading through the broken skin of the plane. He forced himself onward, exploring each corner, each row, each heap of broken belongings, but nowhere did he find what logic demanded: the remains of those who had died here. The absence had grown into its own presence, more haunting than any corpse could have been. At last he stepped outside, his boots crunching on gravel, and leaned against the cold frame of the fuselage. He stared out at the vast wilderness beyond, the unbroken sweep of rock and snow and ice. If survivors had left the jet, they must have gone somewhere. The nearest settlement lay countless miles away across terrain that could swallow even the strongest within days. Had they tried to descend, leaving only fragments of their struggle behind? Had they perished in some hidden crevasse, their bones buried beneath centuries of ice and stone? The mountain offered no answers, only silence. His unease grew sharper when he circled around to the other side of the wreck and found faint marks in the dirt, so faint he almost missed them. They were not fresh. Time and weather had scoured them, but they did not belong to rockfall or animal. They were grooves, long and narrow, as though heavy objects had been dragged away from the jet. He crouched, tracing the marks with his fingertips, imagining figures weakened by hunger and cold hauling crates or trunks across the scree. His mind returned to the words he had seen in the pilot's log, the cryptic mention of cargo security. What had they carried? What had been so important that even in the shadow of death, men and women might have tried to take it with them? The thought unsettled him deeply, for it suggested something beyond survival. It suggested purpose, choice, a decision made in the aftermath of disaster. Survivors had lived here, that much was clear. Survivors had eaten from the tins, lit fires, scratched days into the walls. Survivors had dragged things away into the wilderness. But where were they now? The mountain answered with nothing but the sound of its own breath. As the light dimmed toward evening, Jordan sat down on a rock near the wreck, staring into its hollow shell. The silence seemed alive now, no longer empty but watching him, pressing on him with invisible weight. He remembered the photographs he had found, the diary, the wallet with smiling faces. Those people had names, lives, families waiting somewhere that perhaps never knew their fate. Yet here, decades later, all that remained were fragments of possessions and echoes of survival. It was as though the mountain had swallowed them whole, leaving only whispers to taunt the one who stumbled upon their grave. The wind rose suddenly, rushing through the torn fuselage with a mournful howl. Jordan shivered and pulled his jacket tighter. He thought of leaving, of packing his gear and descending before the mountain decided to take him too. But when he closed his eyes, he saw again the grooves carved into the earth, the soot stains, the desperate words in the letter. Their story had not ended here. It had continued somewhere in the wilderness, perhaps only for days, perhaps for weeks. And, until he knew more, he could not walk away. As the last light bled from the sky and shadows claimed the wreck once more, Jordan returned to his tent. He lay awake, listening to the wind, his mind circling the same questions. What had happened to the passengers and crew? What had they carried into the mountains? Why had no trace of them ever been found? The silence of the peaks did not soothe him. It taunted him with the knowledge that answers lay hidden just beyond his reach, waiting to be unearthed. He knew that tomorrow he would search further, for the mystery had entangled him too deeply. The haunting silence of the missing was no longer theirs alone. It was his burden now. The night after Jordan discovered the drag marks and the eerie absence of human remains was the longest yet. He had returned to his tent with the conviction that he would not sleep, and he was right. Though exhaustion pressed down on him with the weight of stone, his mind would not release him. He lay in darkness, staring at the thin fabric above his head, while the mountain whispered and howled outside, his imagination filling every gust of wind with phantom footsteps, every shift of gravel with the echoes of those who had once walked away from the broken fuselage. When dawn finally came, he felt older than the day before, burdened by more than the thin air and the biting cold. He forced himself through the motions of breakfast, though his food supplies were dwindling and his appetite had fled. His stomach twisted with unease as he drank from his flask, the water numbing his teeth, and he knew with certainty that today the mountain would test him more harshly than it yet had. He packed carefully, securing the documents and photographs he had already collected into the deepest part of his rucksack, and checked his ropes and harness twice. Then, with his boots crunching over the frost-hardened gravel, he returned once again to the fuselage as if drawn by a magnetic force he could neither explain nor resist. The air inside was colder than the morning wind, thick with the smell of rust and abandonment. He retraced his steps down the aisle and crouched once more at the spot where the grooves led away from the wreck. They stretched faintly into the distance, lost among rocks and snow, their path winding downward into a narrow gorge. Jordan stood, shading his eyes against the pale light, and wondered whether he should follow them now or wait. But before he could decide, the mountain made the choice for him. The first sign of the storm was the sudden stillness. The wind, ever present in its constant song through the peaks, dropped without warning, leaving a silence so sharp it seemed to cut through the air. Jordan froze, sensing something unnatural in the pause. Then, with a sound like a giant sigh, the sky darkened. Clouds rolled over the ridges in tumbling masses, swallowing the sun. A single flake of snow landed on his glove, followed by another, and then the storm broke with sudden fury. Snow fell in sheets, driven by winds that rose with a howl, lashing at his face and stinging his skin through the fabric of his hood. The world around him vanished into a white void, the wreck disappearing in a blur as if it had never existed. Instinct screamed at him to seek shelter, and he turned back, stumbling against the gale until the torn fuselage loomed once again from the storm. He clambered inside, slamming against the wall as a gust tried to hurl him backward. His breath came fast and shallow, the cold biting into his lungs. The wreck offered protection from the snow, but not from the sounds that filled the nightmarish dark. The wind roared through the gaps in the fuselage, twisting into tones that were almost human. It wailed down the aisles, whispered through broken windows, and rattled loose fragments like skeletal fingers tapping against metal. Jordan crouched against the wall, his flashlight beam jerking across the seats, and for a terrible moment he was certain he was not alone. Footsteps echoed in his ears, soft but distinct, as though someone moved cautiously just beyond the edge of his light. He swung the beam, but the aisle was empty. His heart thudded painfully, each beat a drum of fear. The storm raged for hours, though time became meaningless inside the hollow shell. Jordan tried to steady himself, but each sound deepened his paranoia. He thought of the survivors who had once huddled here, listening to the same winds, perhaps hearing the same phantom echoes. Did they imagine, too, that something walked among them? Or was it more than imagination? He pressed his palms against his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, but the darkness within was no better. Shapes flickered behind his lids, half-seen faces staring, lips moving without sound. When he opened his eyes again, the flashlight beam caught on something new. Near the front of the cabin, at the edge of shadow, a curtain fluttered. It should not have moved, for there was no draft inside. He rose, legs unsteady, and moved toward it. The fabric hung limp when he touched it, heavy with dust, yet moments before it had stirred like a living thing. He backed away slowly, his pulse thundering, until his legs gave out and he sank into a broken seat. He lost all track of time. The storm outside battered the wreck with the fury of an ocean, each gust rocking the metal carcass on its perch. At some point, his flashlight flickered and died, leaving only the dim glow of snowlight seeping through the cracks. He sat in that gray half-light, ears straining, until finally the storm began to ebb. The winds softened, the snow thinned, and silence returned once more, deeper than before. When he dared to step outside again, the mountain was transformed. The gorge and ridges had vanished beneath a fresh shroud of snow, every mark of the grooves erased as though they had never existed. The jet lay half-buried, its torn sides rimed with ice, its silhouette stark against the pale expanse. Jordan stared at the whiteness, despair tightening in his chest. The trail of the survivors, the faint clues of their path, was gone. The mountain had claimed it back, erasing the evidence as if to warn him away, but he could not turn back now. The documents, the diary fragments, the scratches in the wall, all of it had already pulled him too deep. Even as fear lingered in his bones, even as the memory of imagined footsteps haunted him, he knew he would have to continue. Somewhere beyond the wreck, hidden in the wilderness, the missing had walked. Somewhere their story still lingered, buried beneath snow and stone. He had survived the storm, but the danger was not past. The mountain had shown its power, and he knew it would not hesitate to strike again if he pressed too far. Jordan trudged back to his tent as the last light seeped out of the sky, his body weary but his mind alight with determination. He replayed the storm in his thoughts, the voices in the wind, the curtain that had stirred without cause. Perhaps it was only imagination, the tricks of exhaustion and fear. But a deeper part of him whispered otherwise. The mountain was not finished with him. It was watching, waiting, daring him to keep searching. He zipped his tent shut against the bitter cold and lay awake long into the night, listening for sounds beyond the canvas. The danger of the storm had passed, but a darker danger now lingered inside him. The certainty that he would not rest until he uncovered what the mountain wished to hide. The morning after the storm dawned brittle and cold, the mountain cloaked in a silence so complete that Jordan could hear the faint rasp of his own breath as he stirred in his tent. The snow had remade the world, smoothing every jagged stone and crevice into a seamless white expanse that glittered beneath the pale sun. The wreck lay half-buried now, its jagged wings protruding like broken bones from a frozen shroud. For a long while, he simply sat at the mouth of his shelter, staring at the sight, knowing that the mountain had taken back more than it had revealed. The grooves, the faint marks of dragged cargo, the delicate traces of the survivor's departure, erased, wiped clean as if time itself had rolled over the land and demanded silence once more. He packed slowly, each motion deliberate, as if by prolonging the ritual he could postpone the choice that waited for him. To remain meant risking another storm, another night of voices in the wind and shadows in the fuselage. To descend meant abandoning the questions that gnawed at him, questions that would never leave him once he stepped away. Yet, even as doubt pressed on him, he felt a fierce clarity. He could not carry the mountain's secrets with him in their entirety, but he could carry fragments, enough to prove that what he had seen was not a dream. He checked the rucksack again, ensuring the documents, the diary, the photographs, and the sealed envelope lay safely within. They were heavy, not in weight but in consequence, and he felt their pull as though they might drag him down the slope before he was ready. The descent began cautiously. Each step broke through the crust of fresh snow, sinking deep, forcing him to drag his legs forward. The cold bit into his face and stung his eyes, but the air was mercifully still, the sky holding for now in brittle calm. Behind him the wreck grew smaller, swallowed slowly by distance and by the shifting veil of the clouds that gathered once again on the ridges. It looked less like a jet now and more like a mausoleum, a relic destined to vanish beneath the snow and be forgotten all over again. He turned away before it was gone from sight, unwilling to see it erased before his eyes. The path downward was treacherous, the snow concealing cracks and loose stones beneath its surface. Twice he stumbled, catching himself with his hands, his gloves tearing against unseen edges of rock. His knees throbbed with the strain, his shoulders ached from the burden of the pack, but he pressed on with the grim determination of a man carrying more than his own survival. At times he paused, chest heaving, staring out across the endless wilderness below. The mountains stretched without mercy, their valleys deep with shadow, their ridges etched sharp against the pale horizon. Somewhere out there, hidden beyond his sight, the passengers and crew had once walked. Perhaps they had perished within days and their bodies buried beyond discovery. Or perhaps their path had carried them further, leaving behind traces that no eye had seen in decades. The thought haunted him as he moved, each step accompanied by the silent company of those who had vanished. By midday, the weather shifted again. The wind returned, sharp and insistent, driving flurries of snow into his face. He pulled his hood tighter and leaned into the gusts, forcing himself downward. The world blurred around him, each ridge resembling the last, each shadow stretching into the next. Fatigue sank into his bones, and with it came a strange disorientation, as though the mountain itself sought to confuse him, to lead him astray into the oblivion of its hidden valleys. He clenched his teeth, repeating in his mind the rhythm of his steps, grounding himself in the mechanical motion of survival. One foot, then the other. Breathe, lift, place, do not falter. Hours later, when he finally reached a plateau where the snow thinned and bare rock protruded once more, he collapsed onto a boulder, chest heaving. He unslung his pack and sat with his head in his hands, letting the silence settle around him. It was then that he pulled free the sealed envelope he had taken from the locked case inside the wreck. For days he had resisted opening it, fearful that the brittle paper would disintegrate, fearful too of what truths it might hold. But here, with the wreck receding into memory and the mountain's shadow heavy at his back, he felt the moment had come. He broke the cracked seal with trembling fingers and slid out the pages within. The handwriting was ornate, deliberate, the ink faded but still legible. His eyes scanned the words, and the meaning struck him like a blow. It spoke not of mere wealth, but of dealings that crossed borders and governments, of negotiations conducted in shadows. Names were mentioned, powerful names, men and companies long since absorbed into history. There were references to assets, to transfers, to secrets that, if revealed in their time, might have altered the course of nations. Jordan's breath caught as he realized what he held. This flight had not been one of leisure. It had been a flight of power, carrying not only jewels and silks, but knowledge too dangerous to survive exposure. The envelope slipped in his shaking hands, nearly torn by the wind before he caught it. He tucked it back into his pack, his thoughts racing. The survivors had left with something, dragging crates and trunks into the wilderness, If even one of those containers had carried what the documents suggested, then their disappearance was no accident of fate. Perhaps they had been pursued. Perhaps they had vanished not into the mercy of the mountains, but into the grasp of hands that sought to bury their story forever. The descent grew harder after that, not because of the terrain, though it was brutal enough, but because the weight of knowledge pressed down with every step. He felt eyes on him, though none were there, the imagined presence of forces that would not wish this secret to emerge. He thought of the curtain that had moved in still air, of the voices that had whispered through the storm. Were they echoes of the lost, or warnings from something far more present? He could not decide, and so he pressed on in silence, unwilling to give the mountain more of his fear than it had already claimed. As the final slopes came into view, the valleys widening into the lowlands that promised eventual safety, Jordan turned once more to look back. The peaks stood silent, their crowns hidden in mist, their slopes gleaming with new snow. The wreck was no longer visible, buried by distance and weather, but he knew it remained, sealed away as it had been for decades, waiting for the next wanderer daring enough or foolish enough to stumble upon it. He felt both privileged and cursed to have been chosen as its witness. When he resumed his descent, he carried not just the evidence strapped into his pack, but the memory of silence, of missing people whose fate remained unknown, of documents that hinted at truths too large to comprehend. He would leave the mountain, but the mountain would not leave him. Its breath would haunt his dreams, its whispers coil through his waking hours, for he knew now that some secrets were not meant to be found, and yet, once uncovered, they clung like shadows, reshaping the lives of those who bore them. As twilight deepened and the first stars pierced the sky, Jordan trudged onward, each step taking him further from the place where metal and stone had met in violence, yet no step freeing him from what he had discovered. He no longer walked alone. He walked with the unseen company of the missing, with the burden of their silence, and with the knowledge that he had stolen a fragment of history from the mountain's grasp. Ahead lay valleys, villages, perhaps the return to a world of voices and noise. But behind him the peaks stood eternal, guardians of secrets they had not wanted him to know, and in his heart he understood that he had left part of himself behind, sealed forever inside the flying mausoleum, a prisoner of the truth it refused to release. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss the next shocking discovery. Watch our other videos for more unbelievable stories and share this one with your friends. They won't believe what happened here until they see it themselves.